What we're going to try to do this morning is make it through Joshua chapter 9. And, I mentioned last week that we're sort of running out of time in relation to everything that we want to try to cover in the book. And so I'm going to try to give you just a few key points about Joshua chapter 10 so that you can study that some on your own and just give you a little bit of a guide to help you with the study of that. And then we'll pick up with 11 next week and probably do about that same thing next week. And then we'll have, as I remember, one more week after that. And then we'll have Victory Sunday, the last week in September, or last Sunday in September. So this morning we're going to talk about Gibeon. Before Israel crossed Jordan and entered into Canaan, you'll remember earlier in our study that God charged Joshua to be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. They were going to need strength and courage because they were going to have to drive out all the pagan inhabitants from the land. And that's what we've been studying about lately. We've been studying about the conquering of Jericho and the problems they had at Ai, and then going back and conquering Ai. And so, this is the land that God is giving them, but it's taking work on their behalf to conquer the land. So we know that God was with them in all this. Chapter 3, verse 10 says, "Here is how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites." So Israel was not alone. God's power and his wisdom were at their disposal. But as you might guess, news of the nature of what the children of Israel have been doing spreads quickly. And so with their victories over Jericho and over Ai, that word is spreading throughout Canaan. And so it's not surprising that the kings of some of the nations inhabiting the land gathered together to fight as one against Joshua and Israel. That's some of the primary things that we'll talk about in chapter 10 as we sort of close out this morning. But there was another group that handled Israel in a different way, and that's the Gibeonites that we're going to study about right now. So you may remember this story. It's there are a lot of interesting and unique stories that we've studied through the book of Joshua so far, and the Gibeonites are certainly one of those. You remember that they acted like they were from a foreign country, and they tricked Joshua into making a peace treaty with them. If you think about from the perspective of Gideon, you'll remember a phrase that we've talked about all the way back to the words of Rahab to the two spies. The hearts of the people melted. Remember that? And then we talked about then once that Israel was defeated by Ai, they sort of felt the same way. But if you've got a map in the back of your Bible, I should have flashed one up again this morning. But Gibeon is right in the same area as Jericho and Ai, probably within about 6 miles or so. And so here you have their neighbors being conquered. And so the Gibeonites basically know they're next. If they're not next, they're not far from next. And so you can think about them and probably that same idea of their hearts melting. They know that they're pretty much done for. And so they come up with, from their perspective, what you would consider to be a pretty clever scheme to save their lives, basically, right? So they know what's been happening in Jericho and Ai. They level the city, they kill all the people. And so they basically came up with this plan to keep that from happening to them. So they may not have known explicitly the instructions of God to Israel, but they knew enough to know that they needed this plan. Moses charged the people with the following at the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 7. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. Now, if Israel had remembered all of this instruction, what happened in this morning's lesson would not have occurred, because they didn't only say completely destroy the people, explicitly said don't make a covenant with them. And so here comes the people of Gibeon requesting a covenant. Now, I will say that part of what they shared with Joshua was a lie, and there was basically a little piece of their lie that sort of made it okay for a covenant to occur. We'll talk about that in just a second. I want to spoil the whole thing, right? We'll take it a little bit at a time. So the Gibeonites' deception indicated that they had knowledge of how God allowed Israel to make peace with the cities far away from them. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 20. So I want you to read this, because this is very important and critical to what the Gibeonites are about to do. Deuteronomy chapter 20. When you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword. But the women and the little ones, the livestock and everything else in the city, all its spoil you shall take as plunder for yourself. And you shall enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not cities of the nations here. Okay, so the last sentence you might consider to be the most important sentence in this passage, because when you start reading it, it's sort of a head scratcher for a second. Wait a second. I mean, he's saying, destroy all the people around you completely. That's not, he gives the specific context for this command at the very end in verse 15. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not the cities of the nation here. So he said, those that are far away, if they want to make a covenant, want to be peaceful, you can establish a situation where they are your servants. You don't have to utterly destroy them. But all the nations here where you're going to abide, they must be completely destroyed. You have to conquer this land. All right, and so this fits right into what is about to go on with Gibeon. But the real focus of this chapter as we get into it is not the ingenuity of the Gibeonites. It really goes back to Israel and Joshua and their failure to seek God's wisdom concerning the situation. We had talked about with the situation in Ai that as it began and they went to take the city of Ai the first time, the spies came back and said, let's just do so-and-so, right? Let's just send a few people up there and we can conquer the land. And of course, we know that there was sin in the camp as well, but there was also this situation where there was, let's make these decisions on our own. We've got this now. We've got this under control. And a failure to consult God. And you think, well, certainly after they've dealt with that and had this defeat at Ai, they won't do this again, right? And so the folks from Gibeon come by and they once again fail to consult God. They're tricked into this, and we'll get into the rest of the story in just a second. And we think, what's wrong with these people? But sometimes we do very similar, and this is the lesson, or one of the great lessons of this passage for us, is we need to consult God and His Word and through prayer, and we need to do that on a continual basis. Sometimes we do it and then we're so quick to get away from it, right? And we get to, what I think about a situation. And we don't stop and say, let me sort of bury myself in God's Word for a little while. How many times do we hear a lesson or we read a passage and we think, that's just what I'm dealing with? How many times do you walk out and say, Drew, that's just what I needed today? And that's not because Drew's a mind reader. That's because the Bible is so full of everything we need. And so the probabilities say that when Drew is presenting a message from the gospel, he's going to say something that we need and is going to feel like it's particular to us. And so, a lot of times when we have problems and we have issues, do we just go bury ourselves in Scripture for a little while? Let's just go spend some time and, maybe I've got a problem, with a situation or with my attitude or whatever. Do I just go, it won't take me long to find something that's going to help me, that's going to apply to my situation, because the Word of God is so rich. When we dig into these Old Testament passages, a lot of times it's like, oh, we're going to study the Old Testament. Well, that's just a bunch of history. But, that's not true at all. It's full of, the challenges that people went through and them following God and them getting away from God. And it's all the same kinds of things that we're challenged with today. And so whenever we're faced with these challenges, just like they needed to do, just like we need to do, we need to always make sure that when we have tough situations and tough decisions and attitude problems and people problems and whatever it is that we're dealing with in our life, we need to turn to God through prayer and through study of His Word. Yeah. In different ways.
Even though it was meant in this format,
right,
it still touches our heart sometimes.
Yeah. And I think some of the nature of God's Word is such that we can study it from the time that we're 5 or 6 years old and we're learning Bible studies till the end of our lives, and we continue to get more and more out of it. Has to do with the way that, it's the greatest book that's ever been written, because it continues to speak to us. You're right. Our situation changes, and as our situation changes, the things that will help to build us up the most maybe begin to change in relation to our study of God's Word. And it's just, I don't know about y'all, but every time I go back and study anything, even the most familiar lesson, don't you find something else that it's like, wow, either I forgot about that, or it really didn't hit me the last time that I went through it. And I know that there are folks who are a lot better Bible students than I am who say the very same things about it. So I don't think we ever have any worries about sort of getting to the point where there's nothing else for us to gain from studying God's Word together. It's one of the reasons it's so important for us to be here together now, is that this time to be able to break God's Word open together and study it is just such a blessing. All right, back to our regularly scheduled program here, and talking about the Gibeonites. So Joshua declared the following thing in chapter 9, verse 14. It says, "So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord." So this is in the midst of the discussion with the Gibeonites, and we'll go back verse by verse in detail in a second. But if you want to underline a passage that's sort of key to what's going on here, in verse 14 where it says, they did not ask counsel from the Lord, that's the heart of the problem that's going on here. They didn't go to the Lord. So, irony of the situation, Israel has just defeated Ai using a battle plan that the Lord gave them, enabled them to defeat their enemy. Certainly in the front of their mind should be, whatever's going on here, let's ask the Lord about it. But they, in that situation with Ai, we talked about last week, we talked about the battle plan, right? How they lured Ai out of the city. I mean, basically they tricked Ai because of the great battle plan that God had given them. And what happens? They turn right back around and allow another nation, not a nation of God's people, to trick them because they failed to follow the counsel of God. So if the story of the Gibeonites teaches us anything, it teaches us that things are not always what they seem. But even so, God is always ready and willing to give us the wisdom that we need to help us face the difficulties of life. James says in James 1 chapter 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. That's where we need to go for our wisdom. So we've got an outline for chapter 9, and then we'll jump into it sort of in a verse-by-verse study. Verses 3 through 6 we would call deceit. Verses 3 through 6. And then in 7 through 13, an elaborate scheme. And then 14 through 21, Joshua makes a covenant. So let's go to verses 3 through 6. I think I sort of said this already, but Gibeon was about 7 miles from Ai. So not far at all away from Ai. It was about 15 miles from Gilgal. And if you remember, Gilgal was the first place where the Israelites stopped as they crossed the Jordan. It was very close there to Jericho, also to Ai, and Gilgal is where they are currently encamped. So they're about 15 miles away from Gibeon, where these people are going to come from. So Gibeon is larger than Ai, and if you flip over to chapter 10, it tells you a little bit more about the folks of Gibeon. Verse 2 in chapter 10. Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were warriors. So this is a stronger foe here that they're dealing with when it comes to Gibeon. But the residents of Gibeon were troubled, according to chapter 9, verse 3, when they heard what had been done to Jericho and Ai. And so, they had a couple of options here. They could choose to join together with other Canaanite nations, and that's more of what we're going to see in chapter 10, but they chose to go the different route. So they used their cunning. Now, the group of people that we're talking about here, we can call them the Gibeonites. I believe verse 4 also refers to them maybe as the Hivites. That's a name that should be familiar to you. I think even the verses in Deuteronomy that I mentioned earlier talked about destroying the Hivites and the Hittites and the Jebusites and all those. So the Hivites, same group we're talking about here. So the craftiness of the Gibeonites is displayed with the disguises that they used to approach Joshua and the Israelites. Let's read verses 4 and 5. It says, they on their part acted with cunning and went out and made ready provisions and took worn out sacks for their donkeys and wine skins worn out and torn and mended, with worn out patched sandals on their feet and worn out clothes, and all their provisions were dry and crumbly. And they went to some trouble here. I mean, they really, if you think, there's a party of people coming from Gibeon to Joshua, I mean, they went to some trouble, right? They went down to the thrift store and they got all the, old stuff that they could find. But they patched things up. They got their old moldy food, and they really went to some trouble because it needed to be apparent that they were coming from a far distance, that they were coming from a distant country, And you know now exactly why they needed to do that, because it was only that kind of nation that a covenant could be made with. And so that's part of the scheme. So one writer described their plan in this way: the plot is carefully thought out, centering on items typically used for a journey. It's interesting to note that worn out clothing and moldy bread are the opposite of God's provisions for Israel in the wilderness. Isn't that interesting? So they brought it's just one of those things that's interesting to note, that part of their plan was really just a polar opposite of what God had done for Israel. Remember, the journey in the wilderness, the Israelites' clothes would not wear out, and they had fresh manna on a daily basis. Again, you don't have to pay anything extra for that, but I do think it's sort of interesting. So when the Gibeonites entered Israel's camp at Gilgal, they approached Joshua and they initiated their plan. Let's go to verse 6. And they went to Israel in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us." So the covenant or treaty that they're talking about is what likely today we would call a vassal treaty. Or a suzerain treaty. Now, I wouldn't call it that because I don't know that word, but vassal, means a little bit more to me. But a treaty like this establishes a relationship between a superior and an inferior party. And so, if you remember what we read earlier in Deuteronomy, it says, that you can agree to allow these nations to exist, and they're going to serve you. And so that's the kind of situation we're talking about here with Gibeon. So in this case, the treaty evidently established provisions of mutual defense also. And so Gibeon would serve Israel, but Israel would protect Gibeon. And we see that that's immediately an important part of what continues to go on as we get to chapter 10. And hopefully we'll have a chance to brush over that just a little bit in a moment. So it also appears that there were provisions of punishment for either party if it violated the terms of the agreement. And the reason I say that is because years and years later, David delivered 7 descendants of Saul over to the Gibeonites when it was pointed out to him that Saul broke this treaty. He had tried to annihilate the Gibeonites and he broke the treaty. If you want to just write down 2 Samuel 21:1, the Lord said, "There's blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death." The idea of this covenant didn't go away with just a few years. It didn't have any term limit on it. And so when Saul tried to destroy these people years and years later, eventually David delivered 7 of Saul's descendants to the Gibeonites to be killed as punishment for violation of this treaty. So basically, in studying this passage, we know that the Gibeonites are attempting to secure a peace treaty under false pretense. They look like they're coming from a far country, and that would give them legitimate grounds for this treaty under the terms of Deuteronomy 20, but they weren't. They were from just down the road. So let's go to verses 7 through 13 and talk about this elaborate scheme.
The question is,
Yeah.
if they knew that or not, Gibeonites, that's what God had said for. And if they did, how widespread God's word had gone out from Israel.
Yeah. It's almost too coincidental, right, that they would have done all of this stuff with, otherwise, if I just want to come and surrender, I just show up and surrender, right? But if I go through this whole plan to try to show that I'm from some far off place, I think that you're onto something. I think they knew God's word. They at least knew what the Israelites believed. They might not have believed that it was God's word, but I think fully, they would not have tried this plan if they had not known. We've got a better chance to live if we act like we're from a far country than we do if we just act like, we're from up north of Ai, where you're planning to destroy next. And so we surrender.
What's the time
going through the scripture, I don't think it tells us. There may be some other scriptures that sort of say, the period of time when when the whole conquest was this amount. I can't come up with an answer right off the bat, but I tend to, like you, think that, they went to Jericho, they came back to camp. It's like, what's next? I don't feel like they're spending a lot of time in between Jericho and Ai and what's happening now in Gibeon. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I do feel like this is pretty quick, because once we get to chapter 10 and these other kings are trying to come and they're trying to band together to stop what's going on, what they're finding out, it appears from a military perspective, is that when the Israelites crossed over, when they have the conquest in Jericho, so they've got that spot, they get Ai, and now with the Gibeonites, there's basically 4 cities that sort of make up the area that the Gibeonites have. They have almost cut off the north from the south. That's a big military thing, right? So they come into the middle of the nation, and if they cut off north from south, their strength has increased greatly. And so I suspect what these kings were doing, that were banding together in chapter 10, probably happens pretty quick, as they're hearing what's going on, and they don't have a lot of time to waste. So I think it's all happening, in a pretty quite tight time frame, but I'll try to go back and look and see if there's any time mentioned in these verses.
You do have to allow some of these events to play out. Basically the trial of Layton and the stoning of him.
Yeah.
And all those things. That just, in my mind, that took a little bit of time
Right.
to play out.
Yeah. I just don't get the feeling that there's like months in between these things or anything.
People had to travel from cities to find out, say, we heard what happened in Jericho and so forth.
Yeah.
So there has to be some time.
Yeah.
How much? I don't know.
Yeah.
Information is good.
We're talking distances here of 6 miles, 10 miles, 15 miles. So they're all in a pretty tight area. And so, I think, oh, no doubt about that. So I think we're probably thinking about, weeks, not months or years, that kind of thing. Okay, good thoughts. So in verses 7 through 13, even though the Gibeonites had a great plan here, a cunning plan, the men of Israel initially questioned the truthfulness of what they were doing. In verse 7, but the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you live among us, how can we make a covenant with you? So they questioned them right off the bat. Are you really who you say you are from a far country? So this response reveals that, the Israelites knew they were not supposed to make treaties with people who were nearby. And so they remembered and they knew the words of God as well. In Exodus 34:12, the Lord gives them another warning. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. It says everything there except for the Gibeonites are coming, right? That instruction just applies so much to this particular situation. So the Gibeonites were not deterred by the questioning of the Israelites, right? They were all in on this plan. They were going to take it all the way. And, if I'm a godless people and I just want to live, I know that if I go back home, they're going to attack and kill me and level the land. That likely what's happened to Jericho and Ai is going to happen to me. And so they don't stop. So they responded, we are your servants. And then they attempted to diffuse this tense situation. If they were truly going to be Israel's servants, they didn't have anything to fear. Or, Israel had nothing to fear from them. So, they had plenty of time. It wasn't like they had to make a decision, because they were worried about being defeated by the Gibeonites. So Joshua pressed them for more information about their identity, and that's in verses 9 and 10. They said to him, "From a very distant country your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God. For we've heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorite who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon the king of Heshbon, and to Og the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth." It's interesting that the Gibeonites also mentioned some of the same things that Rahab told the spies in Jericho. Rahab says in Jericho 2:10, "For we heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and to what he did to the two kings of the Amorite who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction." So Rahab was sincere in her words. The Gibeonites were using these for deception. Their real concern was for their safety. So what really prompted this plan from Gibeon was what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai. But in a crafty move, they never mentioned Jericho or Ai. That's right. So they talked about, "We've heard about what you did far off. We have not heard about, what you just have done." After all, they were from a very distant land, and word didn't travel all that quick. And so, once again, they were crafty in even what they didn't say. So they couldn't have heard of these latest developments, so they left that out of the things that they were saying to Joshua. So the elaborate scheme of the Gibeonites also involved directing the attention of the Israelites to their dry and moldy bread. Verse 12, "Here is our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it's dry and crumbly." They also drew attention to their wineskins that were torn and their worn out garments and sandals in verse 13. Here is our, verse 13. I copied down the wrong thing there. Verse 13. "These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. All these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey." So their appearance appeared to match their story. But I don't know about you, just listening to this brings a little bit of doubt, even into just us reading this. Now we know the whole story, but sometimes when somebody's trying to convince you so hard about something, it leads you to think, why are you trying to convince me so hard that you're from a distant country, right? If you're really from just a distant country, you just say, "We're from a distant country. We want to make peace." But, they were like, "Look at our bread. Look at our wineskins. Look at our sandals. Look at everything. Don't we look like we're from a far country?" And so, it just sort of begs of, just too much. But obviously it was enough that it convinced Joshua and the Israelites. So from that perspective, they did what they intended. You're right.
And just think, Israel sent out the 10 spies and the 2 spies with Rahab and so forth. They were after them when they left Rahab.
Right. And these people coming, they had to know what their fate was. If Israel didn't buy their story, they were going to be killed right there, right? And so you think about the stress that they were under in this situation. And even when they were questioned to begin with, they stuck to their story. It's pretty evident that they were all in on this being the way that they were going to try to live. And so as we get to verses 14 through 21 very quickly, in an attempt to verify what they were being told, some of the Israelites evidently tasted the Gibeonites' provisions. So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. That was that verse that we talked about at the very beginning. So they took some of their provisions. It was like they were testing out, is this really old bread? It's sad that this was done instead of seeking the Lord's counsel. They decided to put their human senses in place of divine guidance that had marked their success all the way through the journey to this course. So confident that the Gibeonites were telling the truth, Joshua acted with the evident approval of the leaders, and he granted what the visitors requested, a peace treaty in verse 15. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. So after that covenant was in place between the two groups, then Israel learned the truth. They learned that the Gibeonites were their neighbors. Verse 16. At the end of 3 days after they had made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them. So additional investigation brought the Israelites out to the cities of the Gibeonites in verse 17. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Shephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. So Israel held up their covenant that they had established, and they didn't attack. Verse 18 tells us that the congregation murmured against the leaders. And they were told the following in verses 19 and 20. The leaders said to all the congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. This we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath that we swore to them." But it doesn't mean that the Gibeonites escaped without consequence. And in verse 21, the leaders said to them, "Let them live." So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said of them. So, they became servants, but they lived, and they had been successful in tricking the Israelites. So what are our applications real quickly from these verses? Let me give you two. One is that appearances can be deceiving, right? That one's not a tough one. Individuals can claim to be one thing and can actually be something different. Our task as Christians are to live up, is for our appearance and reality to be one and the same, right? We don't want to be one of those people where appearances are deceiving. We appear to be a Christian, but behind that facade, we're living for the world. Jesus urged his listeners to do just that, to live up to our profession in Matthew 5:16. "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Paul also stressed the importance that we practice what we preach in 1 Corinthians 9:27. "But I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." And so we want our appearance and reality to line up. The trickery of the Gibeonites tell us that that's not always the case, but it should be the case for God's people. The second application I'll give you is that we need to guard against the temptation to rely more on our own abilities and less on the hope that God offers. The Israelites did this when they investigated the Gibeonites' claim, but they didn't seek God's counsel. So for us, rather than trying to seek out and solve all the problems that we have in our lives, we need to look to God. We need to look to God's counsel. And that's what we stopped and sort of talked about in the midst of this study, is that we need to spend time in prayer. We need to spend time in God's Word. We need to allow it to help direct us in the challenges that we face. We need to stop relying so much on our own abilities to solve problems, to solve the things that are going on in our life, and put ourselves more in God's hands. 1 Peter 5:7 verse you know very well, "Casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you." So may we all depend on ourselves a little bit less and on God a little bit more. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do from here because, like I said, we're sort of running out of time. There's a lot of conquest going on in the rest of the book. We definitely have to get to the end of the book to talk about, sort of the words of Joshua as he is his life ends. So we'll figure out what to do about that. I will tell you that, go ahead and take a look at Joshua chapter 10, because it really piggybacks right on what's happening here. And so you have some surrounding kings who, just like the Gibeonites, are sort of desperate. They know that the end is near for them. And so I just don't think we can study this without studying Joshua chapter 10, because the Lord throws down giant hailstones and the sun stands still, and I just don't think we can skip that, right? So we'll do Joshua chapter 10 next week. Thanks so much.